I'm going to talk briefly, because we are still playing catch up, about case plans, family group meetings and case plan reviews. What you will have in your stacks of material is my slides, and you'll also have a brochure from the department's website about family group meetings. That brochure is directed to service providers. If you jump on the department's website and have a look at publications, they've got family group meeting brochures that are specifically for parents and brochures that are specifically for children and young people. So if you're supporting families, you can access brochures, if that's appropriate, that are targeted towards parents and also towards children and young people. The case plan is such an important piece of information when you are working with families who are involved with the department. It's important because it should tell you what child safety is worried about for the family and what child safety thinks needs to be done to address those problems so that child safety no longer needs to be involved. It should tell you who are the important people in this family's world who are going to be helping solve those problems, what is the family expected to do, what are parents expected to do, and what support is being provided to children and young people through that process. So it's a really, really key document if you're trying to understand what's happening with a child safety intervention. And if it doesn't tell you that information, then you might have some questions about whether the case plan is a useful document for the parents and the young people that you're working with. I've underlined some terms on this slide for a particular reason. These are the words that are used by the department in their case plans. So you'll see an overall goal, which in practice might be that the children stay living at home and that they're safe at home. If, for example, if domestic violence was one of the concerns for the department in working with a family, you might expect to see an action like the children will not be present for if domestic violence is happening at home, or they won't be exposed to the after effects of domestic violence. So the way that the case plan works is we've got this overall goal that we want the kids to be safe at home, and then we might have an outcome which is we don't want domestic violence to be happening in the home, and then some specific concrete actions. And you'll see those terms used over and over again throughout the case plan. It should include timeframes for things to be done and identify for you services that are going to be involved. Now, I've included in this slide a picture that's taken from some departmental material, and what you see here is the cycle of ongoing intervention. So this is case plans. The plan is the case plan, which is implemented, and then at the end of the life of the case plan, it will be reviewed, and if the department still needs to be involved, we plan again. So that's how the cycle works. And the strange thing about working in this space is that you'll hear some planning meetings are called family group meetings, and some of them are called case plan reviews. It's a family group meeting if it's the first case plan meeting that the family has had. It might be a family group meeting when the case plan is being reviewed, if that's considered to be appropriate, or it might just be a case plan review meeting. So it's important to listen to the language that's being used to describe what that meeting is, because that will tell you a little bit about the function of that meeting. And when we had a question from up the back before about why don't we have all these services involved in meetings to make plans, the idea of the family group meeting is it does bring together all of the people who can help work on child protection concerns in a single meeting. Once you leave the family group meeting process and go into a case plan review, you might see those services being consulted in different ways, by phone calls or one-on-one meetings or discussions with child safety, rather than being brought together in a big group with family. Case plans usually have a life of about 6 months, and they need to be developed within 30 days of the department's decision to be working with the family in an ongoing way. The family group meeting process is based on a New Zealand model of family-focused and family-driven decision making about how to keep kids safe. It should bring together all these important adults, and what we should be talking about is, why is the department worried about these children? What are the parents' strengths in caring for their child that we can build on? What needs to change so that the child will be safe in the future? And how are we going to look after the child in the meantime while we're sorting all of these things out? And a service provider's role in a family group meeting might be to support family to participate in that process in a really meaningful way that makes sense for the family and properly engages them. Or it might be to be there as a representative of your service provider saying, here are the things that we can do, here are the things that we can bring to this plan. The case plan review, as I said, happens at the end of the case plan being implemented. So the process is, how do we go at doing the things we agreed to do in this case plan? How is the family going? Do we need another case plan? Do we need to stay involved, or have we solved all of the problems? And what you should see is, if the children are now safe enough to be at home without departmental intervention, you wouldn't be needing another case plan because the department doesn't need to be involved anymore. Tricks to be aware of. If you are working with children and young people who are on a long-term order where guardianship has been given to someone other than child safety, so it might be guardianship to a family member, for example, these young people won't be having regular case plan reviews necessarily. The department will check with the child or young person every 12 months and see if they want a review, but they won't necessarily be actually conducting that review. If the child is in care in the custody or guardianship of the chief executive, case plans should be being reviewed every 6 months or more frequently if it's appropriate. And how you decide what level of frequency should depend on the child or young person's circumstances, if things have changed significantly since the last case plan, those kinds of considerations. It should be based on an individual case. Sometimes we might want a case plan review to be done at a family group meeting because it is that inclusive, everyone comes together process. And I've put up there some circumstances in which child safety indicates that they might consider doing a case plan review as a family group meeting rather than as a case plan review. If the meeting is not being held as a family group meeting and it's just being conducted as a case plan review, though, you can see that the department's own material, their policy material, tells us that it should still be an inclusive process that brings family into the decision making. And it should still be involving all of the people who can help in supporting this child, young person and their family. Your role as a service provider, whilst the meeting process might be different, family group meeting versus case plan review, your role as a service provider in supporting family or in bringing to the table support that your service can offer should be the same. I wanted to just talk briefly to some hints and tips for family group meetings. Case plan language is really, really important. It needs to be accessible and understandable for parents and for children. In practice, you might not feel like this is the case when you see a case plan. You might not feel like this is language that's accessible for the family or the child that you're working with. Consider things like asking the department to do a fridge case plan for parents. The department calls fridge case plans a one-page, brief, simple summary of what do we expect the parent to do during the life of this case plan, something that could literally be stuck on a fridge. Children and young people can also be given their own case plans, which are written in language that's adapted and specific for the child or young person, not in the language of adults and not in departmental language. given the impact that case plans can have on whether children and young people come home to family and how soon they come home to family, language is so important, because case plan actions will be telling our parents that we're working with what the department expects of them in order to change things so it's safe enough for the child or young person to live at home. So if the language is not clear and written in a way that the parent can understand, then they're starting behind the 8 ball in terms of trying to work with the department to the point where their children and young people can come home. So it's really important to think about, does the case plan have time frames? Does it, for example, if we were talking about drug testing, where a parent has, in a case plan, agreed to undergo drug testing, does it tell us how the parent will find out when the department wants them to do a drug test? Is it going to be by phone or in a letter? How often is that going to happen? What is going to be the time frame from the moment the parent is told they have to do a drug test? How long do they have to get it done? What will the consequences be for not doing a drug test? Often the consequence is, if a parent is directed to do a drug test and they don't do it, it's considered to be a dirty test. So you want all of that in the case plan, so it's very, very clear to the parent and to the workers as well, what are the expectations of the parent. We should also be thinking about, are the parents that we're working with being asked to do things that are beyond their control and which they may then be judged against at the end of the case plan period. A good example of this is, you might see in a case plan, mum is to go and get a domestic violence order. Well, mum is not the decision maker about whether a domestic violence order is granted. That's a decision for a court. The thing that mum has control over is whether she applies for a domestic violence order. And that language is really important, particularly when you consider that in 6 months' time, you may not have the same child protection workers in the room who helped write that case plan. You may not have the same support workers in the room. And so people might be trying to piece together 6 months later, what did we mean when we wrote this case plan? It's much better if the language is clear, so we're not having a debate at a case plan review about what mum and dad were expected to do. Sorry, I'm skipping. The cultural components of the plan, it's so important, and you know, it's a legislative requirement that when we're working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, that the case plan has something meaningful and robust in it in terms of cultural planning. If you've been working in the sector for long, you might have seen cultural case plans that provide that the child or young person is to be taken to NAIDOC Week, which is a once a year activity. I think that's not, in my view, that's not a robust and meaningful way of keeping children and young people connected with culture and community and family. There is also a legislative obligation on the department in working with culturally diverse families to do cultural planning in a way that ensures that young people know and are connected to their culture whilst they're in care. It's really important, as we've been talking about that, I think pretty much throughout the day, who's in the room, who's being consulted is really important. We know that we are going to have someone from Child Safety obviously being consulted. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, the RE should be consulted. I've made a list of other people that we could be thinking about. The meeting convener or the child safety officer who's developing the case plan will be thinking about these things too. But as community agencies that are working with children and young people, you might know services, family members, community members who will be really relevant and important to making a good case plan for this family that child safety isn't aware of. So you can I think, make a really big difference in trying to intervene at the stage where decisions are being made about who's going to be part of this plan, because you might hold information that no one else knows, or you might be able to support the family to share information in circumstances where they might not feel comfortable to do it themselves, to say, hey, you should be inviting this person. It's also important for us to remember that when we're case planning, children and young people are at the centre of the things that we discuss in case plan meetings. a child or young person should be at their family group meeting or consulted in their case plan review unless it is inappropriate. So the default position is you should have the child and young person having a meaningful opportunity to participate unless it's not appropriate because of their age or some other circumstance. I wanted to end with just talking a little bit about the language of signs of safety. The signs of safety model and implementation of signs of safety or something similar was one of the recommendations that came out of our recent child protection inquiry, the Carmody inquiry. And I've been using some of that language as I've been talking today, and we're starting to hear child safety using this language more. It should be accessible language. What's working well, rather than what is the risk of harm to this child? What are we worried about? It's a much more accessible language, and we see the beginning of that language starting to be used by child safety now, so it's good to be familiar with it. There are resources on the web if you're interested. The training has to be provided by a licensed provider, but there are people out there who are familiar with the use of this model and this language that you can talk to.
I'll just jump in. There is some training coming up in Brisbane for it.
Fantastic.
In November and February. Andrew Turnell will be out with it.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So have a look on the Signs of Safety website because there's some stuff coming to Brisbane and
Yeah, and I think it's a really exciting development in Queensland, I think.
Who's responsible for developing the signs of safety?
Signs of Safety is a model that was developed in New Zealand by in Western Australia by child protection workers in WA. So
Has it been adopted in Queensland?
it's a recommendation of the Carmody inquiry, and Child Safety's response to Carmody as a department was that they thought it was a good recommendation and they're supportive of that. Whether it gets adopted by government, we don't know. In terms of government's response to Carmody, we don't know what that response is going to be. But what we do know is that there was support from Child Safety as a department for the use of this kind of model. And as you're working with children and families over the coming months and years, I think I'm starting to hear the use of that kind of language from the department. So there does seem to be a recognition that this kind of language is more accessible and more appropriate. As to whether the model is formally rolled out is a different question, because that depends on government's response to the report.